Good afternoon. My name is Tyler Sams. I'm the preacher for the Judson Road Church of Christ in Longview, Texas. Thank you for joining me this afternoon as we continue our series of studies looking at the person and the identity of Jesus. Today our study brings us to Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8 and the story of Jesus feeding the 4,000. And so if you have your New Testaments with you, I invite you to open up there, Mark chapter 8, and let's get started looking at our three notes on the life and the person of Jesus here in Mark chapter 8. The first thing I'd have you notice here in this story is the fact that we encounter Jesus here expressing and feeling compassion for others. Read with me starting in verse 1, Mark chapter 8 and verse 1. In those days, the multitude being very great, and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. So you've got a crowd of thousands of people who have been following Jesus now for what he describes as 3 days. And perhaps it is during this time they have snacked, they've had something to eat, but now it's time for the crowd to go home. But Jesus is worried that as they travel home, they have nothing left to eat, and they'll die on the way home. And so you see Jesus responding here, especially in our religious landscape. And no doubt the religious landscape there in the first century, you have Jesus unique here, so desperately concerned about people. You may remember a few years ago when the floods hit Houston and how certain churches and religious leaders, or purported religious leaders in Houston, faced a lot of public backlash because there seemed to be just absolutely no concern, care, or compassion shown towards people who were suffering. We see something completely different with Jesus here. This crowd of people who have been following him for 3 days are hungry. And Jesus felt compassion for these people. And he felt compassion for these people not only because they were hungry, but he noted the sacrifice that so many had put in to follow him. They've been away from their homes for 3 days. Maybe it is they haven't eaten for these 3 days, or if they have, they've eaten all they have, and yet they're still following him, still listening to him. Notice the kind of people who are following Jesus. It's people who recognized there was significance to him. When we recognize there is significance in someone or something, we follow after it wholeheartedly. And that's what these people were doing to Jesus. He's not the kind of person to take advantage of people. He's not in this to receive from people what they can offer of their physical goods. It's not what can people do for me. Jesus' existence here on this earth was all about what could he do for them and what could he do for us. And it was that compassion then that led him to feed the multitude. His disciples answered him in verse 4 and said, How can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? And he asked them, How many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. This is different from the feeding of the 5,000, right, with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. 7. And so in verse 6, he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to set before them, and they set them before the multitude. They also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and then he sent them away, and immediately got into the boat with his disciples, and came to the region of Dalmanutha. And so Jesus, because he felt compassion on this multitude, followed through and fed them. We see here, as we look at the person and the character of Jesus, somebody who was compassionate. But that's not all that we see here in Mark chapter 8. We also see a side of Jesus that many of us can relate to, and sometimes we relate to this more keenly than at others. We see Jesus experiencing frustration. Sometimes we almost have this idyllic picture of Jesus that, yes, we know that the Bible tells us that he came in flesh and dwelt among us, but we almost have this picture sometimes that he didn't really experience things like we do. But Scripture would attest just the opposite. That he had to be made like his brethren in all things so that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest. That's what the Hebrew writer tells us. And so Jesus experienced the trials and the tribulations of everyday life, and that includes interacting with people who are not honest, who are not sincere, and who are not forthright. And so in chapter 8 and verse 11, the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. Now just pause and think. In our study, this is our 19th study on the person of Jesus. How many times have we seen Jesus performing miracles? In fact, we've just had one here in Mark chapter 8, and if this is the region of Galilee, which it appears to be, Jesus has worked miracle after miracle in this area. But the Pharisees come out to him and begin to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, not so that they might believe, not to confirm their faith, but they were seeking a sign from him to test him. There was nothing genuine about their question here. And so in verse 12, Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." So after Jesus miraculously feeds 4,000 people, here's a group of Pharisees that come to him and they demand to see a miracle. And Mark records that Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit. That sounds like frustration to me, does it to you? I mean, he's just had it up to here with these people. People who should have been religious leaders. People who should have recognized him. People who should have known the law of Moses. People who should have seen what Jesus was doing and should have recognized him for the Son of God that he was. But they didn't. They were concerned about themselves. They were concerned about protecting what influence and power they had. And so Jesus sighed in his spirit. Think about how frustrating that must have been for Jesus to have just worked a miracle, to have worked miracle after miracle in this area, only to have hard-hearted people come and ask for more. These are not genuine people. These are not people who were convinced by the miracles. These are people who were looking in these miracles and scrutinizing them if they can find just something to accuse him. There's no honesty or integrity within them. These are the people that day in and day out Jesus is having to deal with. How absolutely frustrating, emotionally taxing that must have been. And so Jesus will not grant this request. Why does this generation seek a sign? He asks in verse 12, "Assuredly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." Matthew records just a little bit more, if indeed this is a parallel account. In Matthew chapter 12, and in verse 39, Matthew records Jesus saying something similar. In Matthew 12 and verse 38, some of the scribes and Pharisees answered and said, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." But Jesus answered and said to them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it." And then Matthew continues, "Except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And then the men of Nineveh will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here." If Matthew and Mark's accounts are parallel here, which it certainly seems to be, Matthew records that Jesus promised one more sign for this generation, but it was not going to be in the manner in which the Pharisees were expecting. Jesus was not going to work this marvel himself before their eyes in the same way that he would turn water into wine or heal a blind man. It would be his resurrection. And notice to whom Jesus compares this. He compares his resurrection to Jonah. A comparison that would have been galling to the scribes and the Pharisees, because if you remember from your Old Testament studies, to whom did Jonah go and prophesy? He wasn't prophesying to Jerusalem. He wasn't prophesying to Israel. He was prophesying to Assyria, to the Ninevites, to some of Israel's most bitter enemies. He was prophesying to Gentiles. And he praised the response of Gentiles, Jesus did, that they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And then implies that even though Jesus would rise from the dead, the crown on all of the miracles he had worked previously, that there would be some in this audience, the scribes and the Pharisees, who still would not believe. No doubt Jesus experienced frustration just like you and I experience frustration as well. And then as you go back to Mark chapter 8, we find Jesus calling out bad behavior. In Mark chapter 8 and in verse 13, Jesus left them and getting into the boat again departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than one loaf with them in the boat. And then Jesus charged them, saying, Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. So following the feeding of the 4,000, Jesus warned his disciples about the behavior of the Pharisees. And he borrows from that bread symbol, and he cautions his disciples about the leaven of the Pharisees. And while Mark doesn't identify for us what exactly he means by the leaven of the Pharisees, Luke does. Luke identifies the hypocrisy of the Pharisees as being the object of Jesus' rebuke here. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy, Luke records Jesus saying. Continue reading here in Mark chapter 8 and verse 16. They reasoned among themselves, saying, Is it because we have no bread? But Jesus, being aware of it, said, Why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke up the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said to him, 12. Also, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets of fragments did you take up? And they said 7. So he said, How is it that you do not understand? You remember back earlier, here in chapter 8, the Pharisees had requested a sign. But the sign they requested was in order to test him. There was nothing honest about it. And so perhaps it is from that basis that Jesus is warning his disciples about the Pharisees, about the danger that was in them. No, you could expose their teaching very easily, but there was this measure of hypocrisy, praying long prayers, right? Desiring the best positions, devouring widows' houses. Jesus would call them whitewashed tombs. Hypocrisy seemed to be the modus operandi here for the Pharisees. Jesus was not going to let that go unaddressed, and so he calls out the bad behavior and exposes it to his disciples. He was not going to tolerate the hypocrisy of religious teachers. He's patient. We see him being so very patient with the people who were new to his teaching, with the people who were sincere, with the people who were struggling. But to those who were insincere, to those who lacked genuineness, to those who were hard-hearted and didn't really care to listen, to examine, to hear, to understand, Jesus had no time for them. No time for their games, no time for their hypocrisy. And so he called them out on it. People who claimed to be interested in serving God, but who really didn't care. These are the people towards whom Jesus offers stern rebuke over and over again in Scripture. So what do we learn about Jesus? Here in the story of the feeding of the 4,000 in Mark chapter 8, we see Jesus feeling compassion. And we take that and we see in it that Jesus not only shows us the necessity of having compassion. If we're going to be like Jesus, we're going to be compassionate people. But here's what a compassionate person does. They don't only feel compassion, but then they find a way to act on that compassion. He felt compassion for the people because they were hungry, and so what did he do? He fed them. Our service to Christ and our service to others is incomplete if we only feel something about other people. More than simply feeling something about other people, we've got to act on it. John would tell us, let us not love merely in word and in tongue, but in deed and in truth. We can say all of these pious things and feel all of these pious feelings, but if we're not actually doing anything about it, what does it accomplish? We're certainly not living like Jesus. Secondly, in this story in Mark chapter 8, we see Jesus experiencing frustration. And if this tells us nothing else, it tells us that we do have a high priest who can sympathize with our existence in this world. What a comfort it is when we feel frustration to be able to go in prayer to God and to have our prayer carried before Him and presented before Him by somebody who knows what it feels like to be in our situation, including being frustrated at times. We have a high priest who can help us, who can hear us, and who can intercede for us. And finally, we see Jesus calling out bad behavior here in Mark chapter 8. And if we're going to be like Jesus, we must be unwilling to allow the hypocrisy of others to jeopardize the souls of those who are around us. There comes a time when we need to be pointed, when we need to be clear, when we sometimes might have to speak in ways that might make other people uncomfortable. Not because we don't care, but because we do care. Because we realize the importance of the moment and the importance of the matter. But in all things, if we're going to be like Jesus, even when we're calling out bad behavior, we've got to feel compassion, concern, love for others, which is just exactly what Jesus did and is the example that He has laid down for us. Thanks for joining me today in this study of Mark chapter 8. I hope you have power. I hope you have water. And I hope you have a much better week this week than you did last week. Have a good day. I'll see you on Wednesday.